So Kevin Knight is going to be our first speaker here. Kevin is a programmer at Iron Galaxy in Chicago and an independent tinkerer. Kevin has been developing games since he was 13, and he's exceptionally interested in pushing the bounds of interactivity. So welcome, Kevin. Take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on Saturday morning. Thank you for Vector Conference for having me. This is a talk about an idea that I've been wrestling with for the past few years. So without further ado, let's get into it. The title of my game is, or of my talk is Soft Games, Sex, and You. And it's an exploration as to why I think our current game mechanics have natural limitations that we're starting to run up across, and how I think that we can all kind of push this forward as an industry and as artists, I guess. So I just want to cover, before we get started, what I want to cover in this talk, and then what I want you all to be able to get out of this talk, if anything. And what I want to cover is that I think the game mechanics we currently have stem from a binary model, and that's kind of like a success-fail idea, is underlying all of our game systems and our game development and design. I think this is fine for a lot of games, but I think it leaves some more interesting and higher level ideas kind of unexplorable or very difficult to explore. And what I hope that some of you can be able to take away from this talk is just a better understanding of the limits of our popular game mechanics and design like paradigms, and some basic tools to get you to go beyond this idea. And if I did my job right, maybe some inspiration to try something new or just tackle a problem in a different way. So all talks start with this about me thing for some reason. I think it's actually more of a credentials check. Just why should you listen to anything that I have to say? So I've been making games since I was pretty young. I went to DePaul University a while ago, 2010, I guess is a while ago now, and made some weird stuff there, Connect stuff, musical exploration things. I got very fortunate and I got to work at Iron Galaxy directly out the gate. That's a Chicago-based studio. I've done a bunch of things with them, ports, prototypes, you name it, I've worked on it. And then while I was doing that, I did sort of a nights and weekends project and released my own side game, which turns out to be a lot of work. So I've been around the block, I guess, and maybe that means I have something worth talking about here. So before we can start talking about soft games, or rather, I think there's a better way to lead into what is a soft game, because that's probably a question a lot of you have. So what is a hard game? I think that this doesn't relate to difficulty at all. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the idea of binary mechanics, and I call them hard mechanics. It just a little bit softer, or not softer. It's a little bit easier to say. Hard games are focused on winning. There's the two outcomes there: of you win or you lose, success or fail. None of our games are exclusively this type of success fail, or very rarely it's this type of exclusive success fail. But they're built on the idea that your interactions either are like you did it or you didn't do it. I think this is a natural evolution, kind of from stepping into the magic circle. You take something very nebulous like physics, and then you're able to say like, okay, well, if I get the ball in that court, in that part of the court, then it is a point if you don't hit it back to me. It's these rules are simple to understand, and they're easy to kind of like layer on top of each other and move with. So I think the components of what I would call a hard mechanic are pretty basic. You have your interaction that results in a condition check somewhere down the line, and that's either comes out to be yes or no. It might be a little more helpful to do that as a as a graphic. So I have this very bad thing that I drew for you all. This is like, what's it look like to be a platformer? You fail if you don't make that jump, and you succeed if you do make that jump. That success isn't like an actual thing that anyone wrote. It's just you didn't die. but that is considered the successful version of whatever your input and an interaction into this game was. So let's cover what an actual soft game is. I think a soft game is a non-binary mechanic. There's multiple outcome states to this. There's not just the success or fail. There's at least a third state in there that you can, that will change the way that the game is flowing and change your actual, will change your actual flow of the game, and it will change the consequences that you face in that game. I think that these soft mechanics, these soft games, are very much focused on goals and consequences. Goals, you can achieve a goal and you can fail a goal, so it's kind of splitting hairs here, but I think the important distinction is that you can exceed goals, you can partially meet goals, you can track where you are in relative to your actual end goal. That is something you can partially achieve, that is something that you can exceed your previous, that is something you can, or exceed your previous best, that's something you can actually go negative in. If the goal of tennis is to get the ball on the other side, you can totally just smack that thing way over the fence in the wrong direction. And I think that could be considered a negative goal or negative progress towards your goal. So I think that this is, like I said, this is something you can have partial or exceeding. You can exceedingly meet this. And this is not a new concept. Board games have had this for a very long time. If you've played some of the Star Wars role-playing games, other tabletop role-playing games have had this idea of, instead of doing this like, yes, you rolled a 15 and that meets, so then you get to do your thing. You roll a set of dice that has failure, they have success, they have partial success, and that is something that the DM gets to determine. So that is kind of like softening this idea of like, I did the thing, I didn't do the thing. Like, you get to have a third option where like you and the DM kind of play off each other, and like, well, you got to do that, but and this is what I think is interesting about this is that it adds nuance and sometimes uncertainty to the process of the game that you're playing. And there's a lot you can do with this kind of nuance and having some sort of unknowns at the table. So like I had components of the hard mechanics, I think that it's only fair that we cover the components of a soft mechanic. Interaction's the same. This is video games. We are going to have these no matter what. I think instead of doing condition checks, we call it evaluations. Again, a little bit splitting of the hair. But the idea of an evaluation is that it can result in multiple of these consequences, and you can get partial credit. Consequences and evaluations, kind of the same thing, but I think it's important to see that your inputs can result in sort of like a bigger change in the game state that's going to be come back to either help you or bite you later. And then we have goals. So ultimately, in a binary game, the success fails compile on top of each other to the point where you have more successes than that person, so then you have the ultimate success. And the idea of a goal is that this is something that, again, partial credit applies. You can exceed it, you can meet it, you can go underneath it, you can go negative in this thing. But it's not gonna just have you did it, you didn't do it. All right, so this is a good time to say that I'm not the first person to think about this. Obviously, they've been in some games before. I think probably the most famous of which would be QWOP. I'm sure most of you know exactly what I'm talking about for this game. It's a goal-based game. There is some hard ideas in there. If you fall, you're done. But the actual main mechanics of this thing are not directly resulting in you succeeding or failing. It's kind of like a system as a whole is propping you up to try to like move forward with this thing. My favorite is Moo Cartographer. This is a game where, so you see on the, I guess, right side of the screen, I'm not sure if Twitch flips it, there's all these gadgets that are just littering the side of that screen. And the idea of Moo Cartographer is that you are manipulating these things. They don't have any direct action that you can see, except for they kind of change the landscape that you're looking at and manipulate it in different ways. And this is just a game about exploring and looking for artifacts and logs from explorers that have come there before you. And I think it's just you're manipulating this thing and you're kind of seeing what it does, and you get hints to how to figure out like what exactly you need to do in any given situation. But it's a fantastic game. So these mechanics have been around, but let's do a ridiculous example. We're gonna go back to like the jump. What does a soft mechanic jump look like? Your goal, make the jump. Very simple. If you get 95% of the way there, your immediate consequence is death. That's kind of like your classic fail state. Maybe you can have like we've introduced like ledge hangs, so you are delayed in your progress in this platformer. Maybe it costs extra stamina. Maybe you lose something out of your pocket, or probably crack a rib. We have your classic success case. This is going to be, I made it, perfect, hit 100%. Maybe there's no direct consequences outside of like, hey, nothing bad happened to you. Maybe as a player, you get a nice little confidence boost, who knows? And then you can have a exceeding goal. You ran as fast as you possibly could and jumped across this chasm and snapped your ankle upon landing. This is a very ridiculous set of examples, but the idea is that there are multiple outcomes for this past the I did it, I didn't do it. So let's do a little bit of an exercise just to kind of cement this idea a bit further. How do we take a hard mechanic and make it just a tiny bit softer? So one of the hardest mechanics I can think of is hit scan. For people that have played shooters before, this is just like if your reticle is over a person and you click the mouse, you hit them. So the idea is we want to add some additional states. We want to add additional outcomes, something unexpected to happen here. Well, what if we add projectile drop? Projectile drop is interesting. It forces the player to predict. It forces the player to adapt. It forces the player to kind of like guess. But ultimately, it becomes a success-fail thing. You either shot the person or you didn't shoot the person. This is a difficult thing to make a soft mechanic out of. Like, well, let's serve one purpose to hit something and destroy it. But there is a really interesting mechanic from Battlefield 3's suppression that I think is really interesting in this. And that is to say that if you shoot near somebody, you are going to induce them into this new state called suppression, where it blurs their vision, it increases their hip fire sway, they are visible on your teammates' radars, and that has added this third outcome to what usually is a totally binary mechanic in video games. Okay, so you might be thinking that seems pretty easy. All we have to do is add more possible outcomes to game interactions. I don't think that's entirely it. I think it's possible, but I think that scales pretty badly. These binary interactions are not easy to write and control. Obviously, video games are very difficult to make, but they're simpler to write and control than non-binary, than these soft interactions. So making soft games have two very immediate hurdles then, which is how to design them and how to write them or implement them, I guess. So how do we do that? This has been kind of like the bane of my existence for the past few years or so, but let's just jump into it. So let's get into the meat of it. A case study. Video games are predominantly based on our experiences. You got to write what you know. Platforming is not something we really do unless you're like puddle dodging somewhere, but they're rooted in these experiences, but they're also rooted in the experiences that we can best represent via these kind of like success fail things. I think that there's a lot of interactions and there's a lot of experiences out there that are not represented in our video games. I think that's because it's difficult to translate that into a video game. We don't have the paradigms, we don't have the historical references of other video games to try to figure out how this thing can be fun. It's maybe fun in real life, maybe it's not fun in real life, but it's something you want to see preserved in this like digital archive format, this playable interactive experience that is just not there. And I think that soft games and soft mechanics might be part of the key that we're missing to start opening it up. This is just a little bit of a content warning. Obviously, the first slide I was talking about sex. And for the next couple of slides, I want to be diving into this as an idea of a human experience that is not represented well in video games, and that I think that soft mechanics could really kind of like blow the door open on. I approach this at a super high level. I don't want this to be about explicitness at all. I don't think that that's an interesting part of video games to me. And I understand that this is a complicated topic, and it can be difficult for some people, and I want to keep this as accessible as possible. And I think that this is a really interesting idea, and I also want to approach that with respect and that it's due. And I don't want to cheapen this at all. That being said, why do I think sex is a good study for soft mechanics? Why do I think this is something that we should even look at? It's undeniably popular in our culture and in our media. It's been around forever. You cannot stop people from talking about it and making content about it. I do not believe that there is lots of engaging sex experiences in video games. They're either cutscenes or they're a bunch of these kind of like really bad choose your own adventure stories where they all end in the exact same way and there's zero consequences whatsoever. And like that's just not interesting or interactive. And it's definitely not engaging beyond the kind of like self-gratifying purpose that it serves. I don't think that sex has success or fail states. People can probably argue this point a little bit, but I think it's more about kind of the fulfilling experience for everyone that's involved. I think that's very easy to have a wide range of experiences that many you can say were good experiences without having that sort of idea of like, you know, they've all ticked this one box, therefore they're all equivalent experiences. It's a very nuanced experience, and theoretically unsolvable is just to say that there's not this idea of like a golden technique that you can bring to it that means that you always master this every time. There's not like a, you know, Dark Souls like ideal layout for or ideal loadout for you to just like truck through all of these experiences. This is something that takes time and attention. This is a good time to point out that there are video games that I think do approach sex as a very interesting interactive experience. This is just to say that there's not as many of these as I think that there should be or could be. Quick rules for this, like I said, I'm not going to be explicit. I think it's way more interesting to just as a game development premise, can we make this experience that we have in real life fun and engaging without the other components of it, without the explicit components that we're used to. So how do we design it? I think you have to start with the basics, the interaction, consequences, evaluation, and goals. You can change the names of these, or this is like possible. This is not like the end all be all yardstick, but it's where I've started to approach this from. So how do we interact? We've got touch, obviously. Rhythm is also really important in a lot of these experiences. None of these are exclusive. Obviously, it's kind of like whatever you need or want it to be. And then there's lots of verbal communication. For the sake of this, I'm going to ditch the verbal communication. I'm not trying to make Tom Clancy's End War, but hot. So then how do these interactions evaluated? So you can touch, you can kind of like create this rhythm that you've got going on. How is this actually going to be gauged in the long run? I think this is like fairly straightforward. It's like, does it feel good? Is your rhythm, is your touch, is it too much? Is it too little? Is it too erratic? What is the range at which that this is enjoyable, and what are the expectations? You know, what's the things that your partner in this virtual experience enjoys? What are the things that they don't enjoy? And are you being able to meet those expectations? And then consequences. Again, consequences and evaluation are very closely tied together. But let's say that we have kind of like if we're gauging your partner's mood, this is like an actual idea of a mood, which again, set of expectations. This is like how aroused are they? How much pleasure are they feeling? This is something where like your interactions can increase or change any one of these ideas. And then obviously you've got the idea that you can have like the ultimate goal achieved climax, or you can like be doing so badly they're just like, no, I'm done. I don't want to. You're not doing it for me. So the last part of this is goals. The goal is pretty self-explanatory, but let's say like, how do we communicate this goal to the player? You could do a meter. I think that's boring, and I think it kind of just like cheapens the experience a little bit. The idea is supposed to be an engaging and interactive experience where like you're trying to figure out like, am I doing this right? Am I not doing this right? Maybe you have part of this figured out. It's not a puzzle, but like maybe you have part of this like, okay, this is working really well, but this isn't working so well. And that kind of like meter fight might be, it might be boring, but it also might be frustrating, and it won't provide enough actual feedback to know what parts are working and aren't working. So we got our basics. We got haptic, visual, and audio. Haptic feedback is great. I think we've already been conditioned to know like what like a sharp bite of a rumble would be like, oh, that's bad. Like repeat that 3 times. That's bad. Whatever I did there was not good. And then you can kind of like have like a rolling rumble for something that is like increasing. You're like, okay, I'm doing better here. Kind of like a softer pulsing thing could be very indicative of like, yes, whatever I'm doing better than I was before. Visual feedback, obviously, could be very explicit, but like let's say that it's going to be this very much abstract idea of like it's representing the mood, like that changes the colors, that changes the like pulse of whatever these visual graphics are, and then we can take the idea of like arousal and pleasure and play that into how these graphics kind of like unfold. Very much similar to like Luxuria Superbia. And then we have audio feedback. This is not easy, again, but like there's tons of games out there that do a really good job of flowing music from one idea to the next, based on kind of like the encounters or the intensity of the situation. And this is even better because we're trying to build this idea of rhythm into the game. So we could definitely have that be a suggestive idea where your partner's like, hey, this is the music that is working for me. And if you kind of like take that and kind of almost like rhythm game it, that could help somebody actually like understand what their partner wants, virtual partner wants, and respond to that. So how do we write soft mechanics? So touch is kind of like a solved thing. We have touch screens, we have joysticks, we have triggers, anything that's going to have more than a actual binary outcome. You can use buttons for this. I don't know how, but you can work it into it somehow. So touch screens, let's just go with that. That seems very straightforward. What about rhythm? How is rhythm going to be? You can't make rhythm, but you can calculate rhythm based on kind of the repetition of whatever your touch input is. This could also be based on like intensity, but you're probably just looking for any sort of like repetition, and then how frequently that happens. The evaluation portion of these inputs is going to be probably the trickiest part. But as I was saying last couple of slides, this is something where I think you can have lots of ranges. This is something that your partner has preferences. These preferences can change based on the mood, or any of the other like kind of like various meters that they have. Let's just call them that for now. Like it can change based on how aroused they are. It can change based on how much pleasure they're experiencing or not experiencing. And the idea of this is to like you have these goalposts that as a player you're trying to, or as a developer you're trying to guide the player into these goalposts and meet these expectations that this partner has. And I think within these goalposts also you can have a wide variety of how well they're doing. I'll cover that in a little graphic in a sec. And then finally we have the consequences, and this is something that I think is also can be pretty straightforward. If you're doing well, you're increasing in your partner or your virtual partner's arousal, you're increasing their pleasure. If you are changing your, if you're being really erratic and you're not kind of being consistent in meeting their expectations, maybe you are shifting the mood into something else entirely. If you shift too drastically, maybe you kill that mood, and that's going to be kind of like a lot of math, unfortunately, to figure out like what's your like threshold for someone starting to like this experience is taking a bit of a nosedive. They want to cut it off. What's your threshold for like this is doing pretty well, but it's not gonna like go anywhere fast from here. So that's going to be just a lot of like, uh, again, trying to avoid doing any sort of conditional checks. But if you layer this with enough kind of math on top of it, you can soften the experience where like one bad interaction is not going to destroy it, but one good interaction is not going to, you know, get you all the way to your goal. Speaking of goal, we have the classic idea of climax in a sexual experience, but that's also going to, you need to like meet this threshold. There's maybe a threshold for arousal and pleasure, and you've met the mood. Maybe if any one of these takes a dip, then you're going to like raise or lower this threshold. It's not a static like you hit it. It's a moving target. So like I said, there was like this idea of goalposts. I think this is pretty important to at least how I've come across and started to develop soft mechanics. I think that it's an idea to look at having these types of peaks and valleys in any sort of input. So in this case, your partner is looking for kind of like a lower end of the rhythm, and that's something that they really enjoy. And as a player, this is like you are trying to find where that peak is, and the only feedback you have on that is, okay, so you know, am I getting good haptic feedback? Have the visuals evolved at all? Are they kind of like opening up? Are they becoming more colorful? Are they becoming more active? Is the music changing in a good way, or is it changing in a bad way? And you can have this idea that your consequences fall in here too. So if you're hitting it exactly correctly, if you're like on the money for your partner's favorite rhythm, that's going to be going really well for you, and you're going to see rapid changes to your feedback in the game. If you're going just too like your rhythm, your pace is too fast, and they're just losing interest, you're not seeing any forward progress, maybe a little bit here and there, but it's ultimately waning. And if you go too far into this idea of rhythm, your partner's really going to hate it, and that's going to kind of like shut everything off almost immediately. So that was a lot to cover pretty quickly, but what do we think we ended up with? I think that we ended up, or this is a very theoretical game, but this is a game about exploration and experimentation. This is something where your partner's preferences and moods can change, and that will alter the requirements for meeting your goal, even if your goal is still this like threshold. How you actually manage to get there and the mechanics that drive the values that comprise your goal are changing. I think this makes the game engaging, at least more so than like, you did the one thing like 5 times and that totally worked. This is a game where you have to kind of experiment and try. It's somewhat represents like obviously a human experience is going to be vastly different than anything we can put into a video game, but I think this is one that is doing a better job at representing the like empathy and the attentiveness that it requires to be a good partner. And I think it's a game that actually represents kind of the spectrum of experiences that we as human beings have. I think that would be something that's much more interesting, and I think it's something that we just don't see a lot of, despite the fact that it's such a popular idea. And so many people engage with like sexual content on a daily basis. Um, whew. Sorry, I've been talking fast. I tried to cut down the number of slides, and I think I just ended up adding more. So let's do a quick recap. This is taking a step outside and kind of saying, what did we do for this one case study, and how can we apply that to something else entirely? The design tips, look at the 4 kinds of things that you want this game to be about: the goals, interactions, consequences, and the evaluation itself is really important. That's something that you want to work really closely with whoever's writing this stuff. Maybe it's the same person, who knows? You're looking for how any one given interaction can have multiple consequences, possibly even simultaneous consequences. This is the idea that like doing one swipe across the screen in our sex game is not going to just have a single evaluation point, and that's going to have one change on the system. This thing can have multiple different changes to multiple different systems inside. You want to be providing constant feedback based on your goals and game states. This doesn't have to be super explicit. This doesn't have to be something that's like absolutely shown like perfect information for the player. This just has to be consistent. They can figure it out as you go. A little bit more concrete design advice. Don't punish any sort of failure or setbacks. People are really bad with negative reinforcement. People love positive reinforcement. So you should definitely pepper your game with a lot of that. So I kind of lied when you're like, you can't just add interaction states or like outcomes. You can't just add consequences to like current binary systems. You can totally do that. It doesn't scale well, but it is possible, and it can add a lot more interesting ideas to a currently existing game or a currently existing paradigm. I think simulation games are probably, I haven't come to the conclusion that if simulation games are soft games or not, but I think that they are comprised of a lot of really interdependent systems that feed into each other. So changes in one are going to result in changes in the other that then feed back into the original one. These games encourage play and experimenting. If you're looking at like total or totally accurate battle simulator, like there's the goal is, I don't know, whatever. You get a number of guys, you throw them against each other, and you have fun. It's about creative problem solving and setting your own goals in your own pace. And people love goals. People like being told they did something right too. But if you look at anywhere in like popular games media, goals are abound. Speedrunners are constantly trying to beat the best time for this game, and the game has been won a long time ago. This person beat the game years ago. Now they're just trying to beat it in under 7 minutes. So I think goals are also super, or as goals you can set for yourself inside of one of these things is also a very interesting idea. So logic tips. This is kind of this is for programmers, but really anyone who's developing the game and is on the front line of that. Like I said, simulations are a great thing to study for this. Be really intentional about any sort of conditionals that you put in there. If you write with a bunch of binary ideas, you're going to end up with a very binary system. Fuzzy logic is a great way to try to get around some of this. It's difficult to control. But you can also be studying any kind of like data-driven paradigms. This is like functional programming, if you've heard of that phrase before. And the idea is that this function does something, or this system does something, but it's all like the changes in that system aren't present with interaction or like input. That the changes in the system are present by like shoving different data through that pipeline. So that's something that's really interesting, where it's like if we're talking about having a partner with preferences and a mood, this is the idea is that you can like set up a data set for like, hey, this is the stuff that the virtual partner really enjoys. This is the set of moods that they can have. And the evaluation process changes based on all of that information. Interactions are not single purpose. Again, this is the idea that you can have 3+ interaction or consequences come from any of these interactions. But these interactions can also become secondary interactions. Think about the rhythm. A bunch of interactions you had before become their own interaction in the system. They can also be evaluated more than once. So instead of just, you evaluate this one thing, you can take that interaction, you can also feed it to another system, and kind of like create this idea where one input might have a good consequence here, but a bad consequence here. And that can help add a lot of balance to balance and nuance to your project. Sorry, I need to take a sip. Avoid conditional and dead inputs. Plenty of games have these. I've spent so long in Final Fantasy pressing triangle near stuff that I'm not close enough to, and it's incredibly frustrating. But aside from that, the idea is that all of these inputs should be taken into consideration. If they do nothing, there should at least be some sort of feedback that nothing happened. That shouldn't just be sitting there as this cloud not doing anything. These goals that you're creating for these games, they should be at least fed by multiple different variables, or you should at least have multiple ways to approach this and try to like achieve this success that you're looking for, or to have the player achieve the success they're looking for. There needs to be more than one approach to this. Can't be like a solvable idea, or shouldn't be a solvable idea. I'm not going to say it can't. Lastly, since I ran a little bit over, I'll speed through this pretty quickly. Why should anyone care about these soft games? Why should anyone care about this idea? People are attracted to novelty, obviously. People love things that are new and things that are different. It's not a super huge pull in and of itself. People also love things that are familiar, but they've already proven themselves popular. So there are games that have used these ideas, again, not maybe they weren't how I described them exactly, but they've used these ideas of like soft systems to be very popular. Co-op was huge. It took the world by storm. I don't know if Benefit made a ton of money with it, but it was in the popular consciousness for quite some time, and a lot of people were driven and attracted to that game. I think that these types of games also kind of stand out from the sea of genre games. There's nothing wrong with genre games. I play many of them and love them. But it's hard to deny that there's not a lot of them out there. There's, new platformers, new Metroidvanias coming out basically every 2 or 3 months. I don't even know, on Steam, possibly even like every month, every week. And these soft games are gonna give you give your game a slight edge where people are they're not gonna have seen it before, and it's gonna be again inherently attractive due to its new and different nature. I think that soft mechanics also can, like this idea of like, oh, we want to be master, we want to master it and speed run it. I think that soft mechanics naturally kind of lend themselves to this idea that like if you can exceed that goal, you can keep exceeding that goal. Obviously, there's a ceiling in there somewhere, but it gives someone the ability to shoot for 110%. From the get-go. It's like, collecting all the stars in any given level, or all the strawberries in Celeste. Like that is this idea of like you can that's naturally added to the game instead of having to incentivize them with these weird collectibles. Maybe just because you're artists and you want to see what the next thing is. For me, I just think they're cool. And that's a good enough reason to experiment with it anyway. I'm in a lucky situation where I don't have to do this for money, because I probably wouldn't do something just because I think it's neat if I had to stake my livelihood on it. But it's interesting to look at, and it's been a fascinating project for me these past couple of years. Oh, okay, I ran longer than I anticipated, but are there any questions? I don't have Twitch up. I probably should have Twitch up.
You're fine. That's why I'm here.
Ah, perfect.
Hi. So for people who don't know, I'm Amanda Hudgens, and I am the audience stand-in. So first question is from Admiral Octavius, and if you have a question and we haven't already gotten it, feel free to add it into chat, and we'll add it. We'll get to it. So the first question is from Admiral Octavius. How would you say to try and create an experience that marries this idea with romance relation making as part of the core game experience, especially considering the broad range of patterns, rhythm to try and manage with something like a polyamorous relationship.
I don't have any experience with polyamory specifically. I hope I'm going to answer this correctly. You brought up a really interesting point. My first like sex in a game experience was The Witcher 3. I was a full-grown adult. I had long since moved out of my parents' house, and I was like, you know what? I was just about time. I can totally have sex in a video game. Why not? And I thought that there was like a character, and she was kind of on this like lawful evil path, but like she and Geralt were hitting it off. I'm like, well, maybe if I progress this relationship, I can kind of convince her of my side of things, or Geralt's side of things.
Mhm.
Ended up doing that whole like sex scene, which is just a boring, weird cutscene. And then I was like the game basically put me on this path where I was forced to kill this character 5 minutes later. That was a horrifying experience for me, because that was not what I intended at all. But I think that like the idea of how you relate to somebody can also be a really interesting soft mechanic. Obviously, it had no bearing in that game whatsoever. They'd already decided that like this thing was going to happen. I think maybe I could have like chosen to be evil with her or something like that. Maybe that would have worked out. But I am not good at being evil in role-playing games.
I mean, I think generally I've heard that that's actually true across the board. They did, I think Massive BioWare released something saying that like 75 or 80% of people don't choose like the evil option in BioWare games. Like people just don't pick. Like
Yeah.
I forgot what they call like the evil option, and maybe like Renegade or something.
Yeah.
Like people just don't go that route because it just doesn't feel good.
It really doesn't. But to sorry, I got off track.
You're good.
I think that the interesting part of managing a relationship is you have a lot of these same ideas. So if you're looking at it in the gauge of like you have the like sexual experience interaction of this, and you have the relationship experience interaction of this, like a huge component of sex is intimacy, and that drives it. So like you can have this this set of like, hey, this is the relationship portion that is very much driven by the same principles. You have, how much does this person like you? How much do you like you meet their expectations as a person? Are you attentive? Are you like they have feelings that are up in there? And you can kind of take this idea of like how someone feels about you, and that can come from any sort of sexual experience that you have with that person. That can be a huge influence into how this person feels about you and interacts with you on a daily basis, on a basis outside of sex. Obviously, a huge part of relationships for human beings is talking. I think that part of the game is probably going to be the hardest thing for you to manage. It's easy to have an idea of like, this person feels very good about me. They like it when I do these types of things, and they don't agree with it when I do these types of things. That's way easier to manage than the actual ability to like talk it out with somebody. Just because you need to have somehow you need to provide the content for these conversations that keep driving it forward.
Yeah.
But I do think that like the ideas that I talked about here could absolutely be present in a kind of simulation of how someone feels about you and what your actions, how your actions impact how they feel about you. I think it's actually a really interesting idea to combine that with the idea of a sex game.
What do you think about the relationships that people form with hard games like roguelikes, i.e. Spelunky? Do those punitive and hard game elements become softer as you engage with it across time? Would a relationship with hard mechanics work out for a sex game?
This is super interesting. I spent most of my week kind of like talking myself back and over the edge. I think that when you build a game like Splunky out of a bunch of these like hard mechanics, you end up with something that is a little bit softer. Like I said, you can have the like any percent speed run, or you can have like a, you know, full hell speed run of Splunky. And the game itself as a huge system is softer. There is ways to succeed at this thing better and faster. I think that the relations people form with hard games. I do think that I don't know if they become softer over time. I think that they become softer when you decide to start taking this to the next level. You know, beating Splunky is still beating Splunky. You start caring about beating Splunky after you can achieve that first goal that you've set for yourself is to win the game, and then like kind of the meta goal after that is where this thing starts to soften up, and you are, you know, I don't know, I was never good at Splunky, but I had to like go to YouTube and like research how to improve my game and what techniques people were using. I didn't even know about the like secret passageway either. Punitive hard game elements become softer. I think that you totally could build a sex game with hard mechanics. I just think that it's something that I talked about it a little bit. It's the idea of solvability.
Yeah.
Splunky is a very difficult game, but it is solvable. There's this idea that like there is your min-max strategy that you can apply to it. I don't think that soft games are like making something unsolvable is incredibly complicated and basically impossible, I think, with our current limitations. But the idea is to shoot for something that has more, or lends itself to being less solvable. It's the idea that you can change, nuance. Splunky does a good job of this with their random setups and kind of like building new levels each time. But the mechanics that you apply to Splunky are inherently solvable. And if you look at, I mean, there's tons of roguelike games out there, so there's lots of opportunities out there to kind of counteract this point. But if you think back to the sex game like pitch that we did, there's not one set of techniques that works out. It's going to be dependent and based on your virtual partner. That's going to be the driving force of what your input is and what works. And even someone who's played the game backwards and forwards and knows all of them is going to have to spend at least a little bit of time trying to figure out like what like problem, like what a solution set they're going to have to apply to this thing. And that's after, you know, hours and hours and hours of gameplay. Again, we can't make a totally unsolvable system. That's really difficult. But I think you can make a more difficult system to solve.
Awesome. We had a response from that, which was, it's from Admiral Octavius, which said, it certainly depends on the type of roguelike. Some of them have more permanent upgrades that make future runs easier.
Oh.
Those ones could be more allegorical to relationships and the partner becoming more familiar with you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that's a really good point. I like that. I need to let that one stew a little bit. I don't know if it makes it any softer, but it is a really interesting.
It plays well into the relationship dynamic.
Yeah, it does. It does really well.
We also had a thing on suggested board games to play that do soft gameplay well.
What was that?
Do you have any suggested board games that do soft gameplay mechanics well?
Lots of tabletop role-playing games. I don't have them. Shoot, I should have included this in my sources. Some of the Star Wars tabletop role-playing games do this. I don't have them off the top of my head. I'm very sorry. But when I post slides and after this is done, I can go. I find some of them. But the idea is that there's this like I said, the success, fail, partial fail, like critical success dice. Like critical success is not uncommon in role-playing games, but usually it's like, ah, yes, you did twice damage. It's a little bit different when you're doing role-playing scenarios. But these are dice where, again, like you roll it and you're like, oh, you get a partial success. This is the idea that you got to do what you wanted to do, but the DM gets to decide something else that happens. And maybe it's good, maybe it's bad.
Yeah.
You can have dice that are like success, like double success. You did what you want to do and something else great happened. But you have like, oh, success and, negative outcome. I've only played that in the Star Wars role-playing or tabletop role-playing game. But you can totally add that to just like a normal D&D session. That's kind of up to your DM's discretion right there.
From Mild Mojo, are simulation games inherently composed of soft mechanics? Are there simulation game mechanics that appear soft but aren't?
I think simulation games are soft mechanics. I think that it really depends. So I really enjoy Octodad, and that is a game where the mechanics are totally soft. You're just flailing this octopus around. But
Literally and figuratively soft.
yeah, very soft. But the progression mechanics in that game are usually some sort of like binary based gate. I think this is fine. Like I'm not looking for I'm not going to be a person who's like, oh, that's not truly soft. There's going to have to be some mix of hard and soft mechanics and gates in any of these games, and that's just really dependent upon the game itself. I can't think of any simulation games. So this is getting back to like the bigger game as a whole. If you look at something like Total War, this is tons of like number-based hard mechanic stuff that's going on. Positioning in games is really interesting because that is the softest thing that we have. There is no inherent success failure in your positioning. It's dependent upon like, oh, well, if you're playing a Dark Souls game, it depends on, what weapon do you have. That is what determines whether or not you were in a good spot when you decided to move that attack. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
what's the range on this attack? Where did I put myself? So like Total War is considered a simulation game. I think that the underlying mechanics of it are all very binary based, but when you like when you zoom the camera way back out and you take it from like 2 units fighting to like, a bunch of units fighting, and it's dependent upon like where and how you place them, who you put in front, I think that ends up becoming a very soft game just by like layering a ton of these binary mechanics.
Yeah. Okay, we have one more question. It's kind of a big one, which I feel bad about like dropping on you, like right as the last question. But it's from Mittens. I could see a possible negative stigma being given to a game that is about having sex with as many partners as possible. How would you counteract this possible skewed first impression? Related question is or could that be a goal for a soft sex game? Or do you see it as being more about a single partner?
That's a really good question. It is a lot to deal with.
Sorry.
Yeah. So yes, there's going to be a negative stigma attached to it. Sex, as much as sex has been a huge influential part of human like culture and like media, there's been a huge pushback on it. I think ultimately that's just because people are going to get like up in arms about anything, even a good positive experience. Even if we did something like the game that we were covering earlier, like
Yeah.
that wasn't an explicit game, that was not like supposed to be erotic or tantalizing or anything like that. People are going to be mad about it anyway because it relates to sex somehow.
Right.
So they're always going to find a way to make that weird and bad. But people are also going to find there's also going to be, even with as much stigma as is attached to it, which is not a good thing, people are still going to find their way to that game who want to play it. So I guess the good news there is that sex has been overcoming stigmas on a personal and small scale level since there's ever been a stigma attached to it. Could that be? In terms of like as many partners as possible, I think that this could equally, I think this game could be about having multiple partners. This game could be about focusing on a single partner's needs. I think the experience is applies overall. Like if you are with a new partner, there's going to be a lot of communication and learning that you have to do to kind of like understand where, like what each other's needs are, what each other wants, what each other expects. And even in a long-term committed relationship with a single partner, there's going to be like there's going to be needs to evolve that. You know, if someone's feeling like this is not working for me, I want to try something new, or just the idea that you got to keep that like novelty in there somewhere. There's a spark that everyone has that comes really easy when you first start a relationship, and then as you progress in that relationship, in things outside of sex too, that it takes work to maintain that thing. So I think it could honestly go either way there. I don't think it should be like a goal for one of these games, but that's, you know, that's really up to whoever wants to make that game. I think it's possible to handle this in a way that is respectful. Again, not going to save you from the stigma, but I think there's a way to handle that that is respectful and intentional, especially from like a polyamorous like a game about polyamory, which is like, again, going back to the idea of like managing multiple relationships with multiple different people. I think that's a really good way to approach that if you wanted to try something like that.
Right. Yeah. So thank you, Kevin, so much. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for answering all of these questions and for giving an excellent talk. We also got some great board game recommendations in the
awesome.
in the chat. Seriously, people keep dropping more and more board game recommendations.
Oh, this is really good.
In the chat on Twitch. So if anyone wants to check out the Twitch chat, you can definitely do that. If people want to find you, Kevin, where can they do that?
Oh, that is the. I don't know if that GIF was playing. I'm on Twitter. 5 out of Kevin is the handle I go by. I can drop that information in Twitch chat too. I have an email. It's just kevinthomasknight@gmail.com if anyone really wants to email me. I think I probably am on Twitter more often, but I can put that in the slide and then put that up too.
Okay.